Picture this. It's early March 1867. You are in this bustling, incredibly noisy wagon wheel factory in Indianapolis.
Okay, setting the scene.
Yeah, and there's a young supervisor hunched over, adjusting a piece of heavy machinery. He's meticulous. He's known for his mechanical inventiveness. But then a sharp metal file slips.
Oh, no.
It flies up and directly pierces his right eye. And because of this rare, terrifying medical condition where trauma to one eye causes the other to sympathetically fail, his left eye rapidly shuts down too.
So he's just instantly plunged into total darkness.
Instantly. For 6 excruciating weeks, he is confined to a pitch-black room, absolutely terrified that he's going to be blind for the rest of his life.
I mean, you can't even imagine the panic.
Right. But then, miraculously, his sight begins to return. And the moment it does, he makes a completely radical decision. He decides to walk away from industrial society entirely.
Just quits right there.
Exactly. He packs a small bag and embarks on a 1,000-mile walk to the Gulf of Mexico. You probably guessed it by now, but this is the origin story of John Muir.
It's wild because when you look at the trajectory of his life, that 6 weeks of literal darkness is the absolute crucible of his story. It's so much richer than the popular image we have of him today.
For sure. I mean, when most people hear the name John Muir, they picture the bearded elder statesman, the father of the national parks.
Right, the stoic guy whose face is stamped on the back of the California State Quarter.
Exactly. But the real story that we're looking at in today's deep dive is incredibly wild and surprisingly conflicted. We've got a great stack of historical documents, biographies, and modern analyses here.
And our mission today is to look past that polished historical monument of a man. We are exploring a brilliant but irregular college student, a draft dodger, and a man who, ironically, actually loathed writing.
Yeah, and a deeply complex historical figure whose legacy is currently at the center of some really intense modern cultural debates. So, okay, let's unpack this. Because to me, this factory accident feels almost like a superhero origin story.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. Like losing his sight temporarily gave Muir this superpower, a hyper clarity about his true purpose in life, and an absolute uncompromising devotion to the natural world.
Well, and that hyper clarity was always brewing under the surface. But to truly understand his devotion to nature, we actually have to rewind to his childhood. He wasn't born in the American wilderness.
Right. He's from Scotland.
Yeah, born in 1838 in a small coastal town called Dunbar. He immigrated to the United States with his family in 1849, and they settled on a farm in Wisconsin. And his upbringing was heavily defined by his father, Daniel, who was incredibly strict.
Wait, calling him strict almost feels like an understatement based on these sources.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, his father actually left the Church of Scotland because he didn't think it was rigorous enough and joined a congregation of the Disciples of Christ. He demanded that young John memorize massive portions of the Bible.
Just endless memorization.
Yeah, Muir later wrote that he learned the New Testament and most of the Old Testament by heart and by sore flesh. He was subjected to frequent physical beatings if his attention wandered even slightly from his religious studies.
Which is just brutal, and it makes complete sense why he ran to the woods as a kid to escape. But what's fascinating is that he didn't abandon religion altogether.
No, he just swapped the church for the forest.
Exactly. That is a crucial observation. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the intense religious framework his father forced on him didn't vanish. It simply transferred to a new text.
The Book of Nature.
Right. He replaced his father's orthodox, literal Bible with what he called the Book of Nature. He began to view wild landscapes not just as beautiful scenery, but as direct, uncorrupted creations from the hand of God.
And because he was a naturally restless kid who loved fighting and, hunting for birds' nests, nature became his physical and spiritual sanctuary.
And that desire to escape eventually leads him to the University of Wisconsin in Madison.
But, true to form, he refuses to play by the academic rules.
Yeah.
He took an eclectic mix of classes, chemistry, geology, literature, for a couple of years, but never actually followed a degree program.
Yeah, the university records literally listed his class status as irregular gent.
Love that. Irregular gent.
It's perfect for him. And it was there, as an irregular gent, that he had a profound awakening. It happened under a towering black locust tree on campus.
Oh, the botany lesson.
Yeah, a fellow student plucked a flower from the tree and gave him an impromptu botany lesson, explaining how this giant, imposing tree was actually in the pea family, sharing an underlying anatomical structure with the tiny, straggling pea plant.
They blew his mind, didn't it?
Totally. Muir later wrote that this specific lesson, seeing the hidden, interconnected architecture of nature, sent him flying to the woods in wild enthusiasm.
But world events forcefully interrupted that enthusiasm. In 1863, the U.S. Civil War is raging. The draft is instituted. And to avoid conscription, Muir's brother flees to Canada West.
And Muir eventually drops out of school and follows him there in 1864.
Right. He spends his time wandering the Canadian woods, collecting plants, and working in a rake factory and sawmill. He didn't actually return to the U.S. until 1866, eventually taking that supervisor job at the wagon wheel factory in Indianapolis.
So when that sharp file slips and blinds him a year later, it forces a massive reckoning. He had been trying to balance his mechanical genius — he was actually a prolific inventor of wooden clocks and automated desks — with his love of nature.
But the temporary blindness convinced him that he was, wasting his life in dark factories.
Exactly. So with his vision fully restored, he decides to finally read that book of nature cover to cover. He chooses to take the wildest, leafiest, and least trodden way he can find.
Which leads to the Big Walk. He sets off on a 1,000-mile walk from Kentucky down to Florida in 1867. He has no real map, just a compass, some spare clothes, and a plant press.
And it was almost his final journey. The physical toll of the walk was immense.
Right, the malaria.
Yeah, when he finally reaches Cedar Key on the Gulf Coast of Florida, he is struck down by a massive bout of malaria. He spends 3 months in a delirious state, hovering near death. He is only saved by the sheer luck of being taken in by a local family, the Hodgsons, who nurse him back to health.
But once he can stand again, his wanderlust kicks right back in. He literally climbs onto their roof, spots a ship heading for Cuba, and decides on the spot to board it.
Just completely spontaneous.
Completely. He studies shells in Havana, catches a schooner to New York, and books passage to California. In 1868, he arrives in San Francisco, immediately asks a carpenter the quickest way out of town, and walks to Yosemite.
And his reaction to seeing Yosemite Valley for the first time is just visceral. He scrambles down steep cliff faces, whooping and howling at the waterfalls, completely overcome by the scale of the granite walls.
He ends up working as a shepherd for a season just to fund his ability to stay in the high country, right? And he builds himself this tiny, incredibly quirky cabin in Yosemite Valley.
Oh, the cabin is amazing. Because he wanted to constantly hear the sound of the water, he intentionally built it so that a diverted section of Yosemite Creek flowed directly through a corner of his room.
Okay, I have to stop you there. Because while that sounds like an incredibly romantic, idyllic lifestyle, wasn't he basically just a brilliant drifter at this point? I mean, how does a guy living in a makeshift cabin with a creek running through his bedroom end up shaping national environmental policy?
That is the core paradox of Muir. And the shift happens because he transitions from pure observation to rigorous scientific theory. Muir wasn't just looking at the mountains in awe, he was reading their history.
Geology stuff.
Right. As he studied the sheer vertical walls of Yosemite Valley, he began to theorize that they were carved out slowly over millennia by massive ancient glaciers.
Which directly contradicted the accepted scientific consensus of the time. Because Josiah Whitney, the highly respected head of the California Geological Survey, insisted that Yosemite was formed by a catastrophic earthquake.
Whitney thought the bottom of the valley just basically dropped out.
Right. And Whitney publicly mocked Muir, dismissing him as just some uneducated sheep herder.
Because Whitney was an academic who looked for sudden catastrophic events to explain geology, but Muir, because he actually lived in the environment year-round, understood slow, incremental, natural forces.
And Muir gets completely vindicated by 2 major events. First, in 1871, Muir discovers a living, active alpine glacier right there below Merced Peak in the Sierras, proving glaciers were a local reality.
And then comes the earthquake.
Right, in March 1872, a massive earthquake hits the Owens Valley, shaking Yosemite violently. While all the other settlers in the valley are panicking, terrified that Whitney's theory is playing out and the valley floor is going to drop out from under them, Muir runs out of his cabin in the middle of the night,
yelling, "A noble earthquake!"
Yes, a noble earthquake. He calmly surveys the fresh rock slides in the moonlight. He realized the earthquake just knocked loose rocks into sloping rubble at the base. Those talus piles, meaning earthquakes couldn't have cleanly sliced the sheer vertical granite walls of Yosemite.
What's fascinating here is how his deep, almost obsessive sensory immersion in nature allowed him to see geological truths that academically trained experts completely missed. He filled his journals with meticulous data on temperature, cloud formations, and plant life.
He built a bulletproof scientific argument through raw, lived experience. And because of this brilliant geological insight, powerful people start seeking out this eccentric guy in the woods.
Like Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Exactly. In 1871, Emerson travels to Yosemite specifically to meet Muir. And Emerson is so impressed by his intellect that he offers Muir a teaching position at Harvard.
Which is a huge deal.
Massive. But Muir turns him down flat, writing that he wouldn't trade God's big show for a mere profship.
But turning down Harvard didn't mean staying out of politics, because Muir realized that the pristine, high-country meadows he loved were being actively destroyed by domestic sheep.
Oh, the hoofed locusts?
Right. He famously and rather brutally dubbed them hoofed locusts because they would chew the delicate grasslands down to the dirt, causing massive erosion.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me, because Muir loved absolute solitude. He preferred the company of trees over people. Yet his greatest historical achievements came from his ability to leave his cabin, travel back to civilization, and network.
Network with publishers, academics, and politicians.
Yeah. In 1889, he teams up with Robert Underwood Johnson, an influential East Coast magazine editor.
And Johnson realized that to save Yosemite from the hoofed locusts, they needed federal protection. But Congress wouldn't act unless the public demanded it. So Johnson pushed Muir to write.
Which led to those 2 landmark articles for the Century magazine. Muir used incredibly evocative, visceral language that made East Coast readers feel an intense emotional connection to a landscape they had never personally seen.
And it worked. The public outcry pushed Congress to pass a bill in 1890 establishing Yosemite National Park.
And 2 years later, Muir and a group of academics co-found the Sierra Club to actively defend these new public lands.
His most legendary networking success, however, happened in 1903 with sitting President Theodore Roosevelt.
A famous camping trip.
Yes. Roosevelt travels to California, and Muir essentially kidnaps the president. They ditch the political entourage, the Secret Service, and the press, heading deep into the Yosemite backcountry.
They sleep out in the open air at Glacier Point and wake up dusted with a fresh layer of snow. It's such a great image.
It really is. And underneath the giant sequoias, Muir didn't use charts or data to persuade the president. He used the shared sensory experience of the wild. He successfully convinced Roosevelt to strip control of Yosemite Valley away from state mismanagement and put it under strict federal protection.
It was a masterful piece of political persuasion. But navigating that political realm also brought Muir into his most bitter ideological conflicts. The establishment of federal lands triggered the great schism of the American environmental movement.
A schism defined by a deeply personal battle between Muir and a man named Gifford Pinchot.
Right. Pinchot was the first head of the United States Forest Service. And initially, he and Muir were close friends who camped together, but they represented 2 fundamentally incompatible philosophies.
Pinchot was a champion of conservation.
Yeah, he viewed the forest like a high-yield savings account where you live off the interest, the timber. As a professional forester, he viewed his job essentially as tree farming.
Right. The goal was to provide sustainable resources for a rapidly growing, industrializing nation.
But Muir, on the other hand, was the ultimate champion of preservation. He viewed the wilderness not as a savings account, but as a priceless family heirloom. You don't sell it off for parts, you protect it in a vault.
He valued nature entirely for its spiritual, transcendent qualities, calling the national parks places for rest, inspiration, and prayers.
And in 1897, this philosophical difference exploded. Pinchot released a public statement supporting sheep grazing in the newly established forest reserves.
Which Muir obviously hated.
Exactly. Muir confronted him directly in a hotel lobby, and when Pinchot refused to back down, Muir bluntly told him, "I don't want anything more to do with you." Their friendship ended right there.
And the American environmental movement permanently split into 2 factions. You know, it forces us to ask a really difficult question for the listener. In the context of a rapidly expanding nation at the turn of the 20th century, who was actually right?
That's a tough one.
Is it realistic to lock away vast natural resources purely for the spiritual nourishment of the public? Or is Pinchot's vision of sustainable, utilitarian resource management the only practical path for a modern society?
That rigid, uncompromising belief that nature must remain totally untouched is exactly what made Muir an environmental hero. But ironically, that exact same philosophy is what's putting his legacy on trial today. We have to unpack the myth of the pristine wilderness.
Right. Muir's entire philosophy rested on the idea of nature being utterly uncorrupted by human hands. But the landscapes he viewed as untouched, like Yosemite Valley, had actually been actively managed by indigenous peoples for millennia.
They used deliberately set, low-intensity fires to clear undergrowth, cultivate specific plants, and manage the ecosystem. Muir either didn't recognize this or just chose to ignore it.
Furthermore, his early writings reflect some deeply troubling attitudes. During his initial years in California, he wrote disparagingly about the Miwok people in Yosemite, calling them dirty and hideous, and claiming they seem to have no natural place in the landscape.
And during his 1,000-mile walk through the post-Civil War South, he used highly derogatory language to describe the African Americans he encountered.
But the historical record also shows that Muir's views evolved significantly as he aged. During his extensive later travels in Alaska, he lived alongside indigenous tribes and grew to deeply respect their culture.
He praised their low-impact lifestyle compared to the destructive habits of white settlers.
Right. He was even adopted into a Tlingit tribe and given the honorable name Enkutahan, meaning adopted chief. He also began writing passionately about the essential equality of all races, stating that all people were children of one father and that we all flow from one fountain soul.
This complex duality sparked a major internal reckoning in 2020 within the Sierra Club, the very organization he founded. Michael Brune, the executive director at the time, published a forceful piece calling for a reevaluation of Muir.
Brune highlighted his racist comments and argued that centering Muir's legacy alienates indigenous people and people of color from the modern environmental movement.
But that was highly contested within the organization itself, wasn't it?
Very much so. Aaron Mayer, who made history as the Sierra Club's first black president, strongly pushed back against Brune's statement. Mayer, alongside other board members, called Brune's take revisionist and ahistorical.
What was Mayer's argument?
Mayer argued that while Muir certainly held the prejudices typical of a 19th century white man early on, his later profound writings on universal equality and his fierce critiques of white, profit-driven cultures show a man who evolved. Mayer argued that dismissing Muir erases the very foundation of environmental protection.
We aren't here to tell you how to weigh those arguments. The sources present a man of immense vision who also held blind spots that alienated the very people who originally curated the landscapes he loved. How do we hold both of these truths at once? It's a profoundly human contradiction.
Absolutely. And his final years were defined by a massive, heartbreaking failure. The ultimate test of his preservationist philosophy came with the Hetch Hetchy Valley.
Right, Hetch Hetchy. It was a stunning glacial valley within the borders of Yosemite National Park. Muir believed it was a geological twin to Yosemite Valley itself.
But the rapidly growing city of San Francisco, especially after the devastating 1906 earthquake and fire, desperately needed a reliable water supply. They proposed damming the Tuolumne River and flooding Hetch Hetchy to create a massive municipal reservoir.
And Muir fought this project with every ounce of energy he had left. He mobilized the entire Sierra Club, launching a nationwide letter-writing campaign.
He wrote impassioned pleas to President Roosevelt and the American public. He famously declared, "Damn Hetch Hetchy, as well damn for water tanks the people's cathedrals and churches, for no holier temple has ever been consecrated by the heart of man."
Despite years of fierce fighting, the utilitarian vision of Gifford Pinchot won out over Muir's preservationism. In 1913, President Woodrow Wilson signed the bill authorizing the dam. The valley was flooded.
Muir was completely devastated, writing to a friend that the destruction of the valley went straight to his heart. He died the very next year, on Christmas Eve in 1914, of pneumonia.
There is one final, almost tragic irony to Muir's story that I think perfectly encapsulates his life. For a man who published over 300 articles and 12 books writings that literally moved presidents, established national parks, and altered the map of the United States, he absolutely loathed the act of writing.
He despised it. He called it a long, tiresome, endless job.
Yeah, his secretary reported that he would pace the floor, writing and rewriting a single sentence 20 times, groaning over his labors. He only endured the torture of writing because friends like his old college mentor, Jean Carr, constantly pressured him.
She understood that his evocative words were the only weapon strong enough to save the places he loved from industrialization.
He truly believed that words were a weak, flawed instrument for capturing reality. He famously wrote, "No amount of word-making will ever make a single soul to know these mountains. One day's exposure to mountains is better than a cartload of books."
He sacrificed his beloved solitude to write those books, solely so that the mountains would still be there for future generations to experience firsthand?
So we've covered a massive journey today. The blinding factory accident, the 1,000-mile walk, the eccentric cabin with the indoor creek, the intense political battles under the sequoias, the complex racial legacy, and the reluctant rider who lost his final battle.
This was a man who used his obsessive, hyper-focused sensory connection to the earth to force a rapidly industrializing nation to hit the brakes and protect its wild cathedrals.
He was a deeply flawed, undeniably brilliant inventor who realized his greatest invention wasn't a mechanical desk or a wooden clock in a factory, but an entirely new way for humanity to perceive the natural world.
That's a powerful way to look at it.
So what does this all mean? Muir believed that nature was a literal book written by the hand of God, uncorrupted by civilization. He found his ultimate clarity when he almost lost his sight entirely.
Yeah.
As you look at the natural spaces around you today, whether it's a vast protected national park or just a small, cultivated city garden, ask yourself, what kind of story are we actively writing over that original text? And are we leaving any blank pages for the generations that come after us?
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, and we'll catch you next time.